During that time, when I was in Damascus, I worked for a period of time as a media advisor for Assama al-Assad's charities, Firdos and Mawrid. And the reason why I bring this up isn't just to prove to you that I'm not a neocon, as I've been branded in the press, or a liberal hawk, or whatever else somebody wants, what kind of mud they want to throw at you, but because when I was working for Assama's charities, they primarily dealt with economic issues, and this was before the Syrian economy was quote-unquote cool or important. U.S. policymakers or think tanks I used to work for used to tell me, Andrew, you just don't get it. The Syrian regime, it doesn't care anything about economics. It only cares about politics. It only cares about the Golan. Well, I can tell you that I'm not exactly sure about that, but when I worked for Assama's charities, Assama's charities were organized and obsessed with one thing, that during the last time we had this kind of repression in Syria, in the 80s and the 1990s, everybody stayed home for about 15 years, more or less. And what do men and women do when they stay home for long periods of time? Well, they have a lot of children. There's an intermediate step in there we're not going to talk about today, but they have a lot of children, okay? During that period of time, Syria was among the 20 fastest growing populations on the planet. Syria. And all of those people are now hitting the job market. And Assama's charities and Assama herself and a lot of people who worked in Syria in quote-unquote reform, and I think we can put quotes around it for obvious reasons, were obsessed with this idea. They've seen this coming for a long time. They knew that economics was key to their grip on power. And now it is more than ever before. And I'll get into the discussions a little bit about that. Concerning very briefly, U.S. policy options at the end. Over the last 5 months, or after 5 months of killing, there is now convergence among the United States, the Europeans, Arab countries, and even Turkey, that Assad does not have a concerted plan to get out of this. I mean, the last straw really was everyone questioning the wisdom. Why would a minority Alawite-dominated regime launch a massive attack on the eve of Ramadan that they had carried out in 1982, one of the worst massacres in the history of the Middle East? This doesn't really smack of great leadership, steadfastness and flexibility, which is what Bouthena Shaban used to call it, and Imad Mustafa. It just does not seem like a competent path out of the current crisis. I think I was just recently in Europe and in Turkey, and I can tell you a little bit that I think that there's convergence on the fact that Assad doesn't know how to get out of this one, that the political and the security solutions are not working. The security solutions have rapidly undermined his credibility in terms of any kind of political solution. But I think that there is not yet complete convergence on what to do about it. I think that is, though, quickly emerging, and I think you'll see President Obama. I don't know if you know this, but just in a few minutes ago, the Syriatel was designated by the Treasury Department, as well as the Commercial Bank of Syria, for proliferation issues. Now, just as a little heads up, that will allow the European powers to do certain things vis-a-vis the Commercial Bank of Syria, especially as concerns oil payments. And of course, I think some of you have seen in the press, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, about the introduction of an energy sanctions bill on Syria last week. There have been considerable constraints on the U.S. and the Obama administration's position since this has broken out. Ted's going to go a lot more into this. I'll just rattle off a couple. One is that, and I think it's very fair to say, that the opposition is divided. They've come a long way, but it's very difficult to coordinate when you have an exiled opposition and then you have such a robust protest movement on the ground. It's very hard to coordinate these two positions. Also, the protests are primarily being driven by young people and some of these folks that I described a little bit earlier. And how they communicate and so on doesn't necessarily lead itself to a coherent leadership. This is natural for these kind of organizations. In fact, if they did form a linear structure, the Assad regime would probably try and decapitate it. So it's its greatest strength, and at the same time, its weakness. Also, the U.S. position has been constrained because it needs Europeans. Okay, those someone who tells you that the Assad regime never moves in response to pressure, they were obviously not at the Rayak Air Base in the Bekaa on April 27th, 2005. I was there when the Syrians pulled out of Lebanon. Okay? The Syrian regime does move in the face of concerted multilateral pressure. It doesn't happen very often. A stop clock is right twice a day, right? So in this particular case, though, we are moving towards that. And in that particular case, it will be interesting to see how that pressure works vis-a-vis Syria's domestic policies. Again, we don't see a plan by the Assad regime to get out of it. But that multilateral pressure combined with sanctions do motivate the Assad regime. How do we know that sanctions motivate the Assad regime? Because for the last 2 years, in discussions with the United States and with the Europeans, in exchange for a peace treaty with Israel, we were going to drop our sanctions on Syria. Now, it would be a quid pro quo. It would be part of a long process. But this has been from the beginning of the process. So why would the hardest bargainers in the world put sanctions on the table first if it didn't matter to them? It's because it does. Because the economy does matter to the Syrians. It's a trading culture. Contact with the outside world matters. And that's an area of leverage. There are 3 options going forward, not 2. We always talk about the regime or we talk about the opposition. Okay, I don't think anybody's really interested in engaging the regime as it is. I mean, you can go and talk to it, but it's very clear that you're not going to make very much headway. And on the other hand, we don't just have the option of the opposition as it is now, and everyone's saying, oh, it's so fragmented and whatever. No, there's a third option, and there could be a coup by Alawites, as I think Radwan and Ausama had mentioned, that could lead to some kind of transition process and a democratic process. Now, we don't know exactly where that is, but Ali Habib's resignation indicates that there is a division inside of the regime and around the regime about what to do. I think the Alawite community knows that in order for there to be a soft landing for this, or that there doesn't have to be a hard landing for this, there could be a soft landing. That is not yet clear. Very important move was the Saudi announcement a few days back. Why? Well, it allows the other Arab countries, Bahrain, Qatar, Qatar had already cut relations, also the Kuwaitis. That's true in terms of the Arab League, but most importantly, Saudi Arabia is very influential in eastern Syria. I spent a lot of time among the tribes when I was there. A lot of them have Saudi passports. There are family ties that go down into Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have a lot of money. It's also the area of Syria with the least government control. So if you read Syria comment and you think that the regime is really worried about Jisr al-Shughur being the next Benghazi, I think you'd be much more worried about eastern Syria, where Saudi Arabia has influence, as does the UAE, and it's home to Syria's oil and gas production, which is the lifeline of the regime. It accounts for about 1/3 of revenue. I just got back from Turkey. Turkey plays a subtle role in all of this. You saw Davutoglu's visit. Doesn't seem like he really walked away with anything. Erdogan said today, well, they're shooting their own people, but we're going to give them 10 to 15 days. I mean, it's really hard to know who's going to be left after that. That's a long time, and I don't think anyone else is going to be waiting that long. But the Turkish position is more subtle than you think. There are divisions inside of the AKP about what to do between primarily, and this is broad brushstrokes, 2 groups. One, there's a more idealistic, conscious faction in the AKP that realizes that all of these protesters are getting mowed down during Ramadan. Turkey is implicitly a Sunni power. I don't think most Turks think about it that way, but a lot of people inside of Turkey are very concerned about what's going on in Syria, and a lot of the analysts there who cover Syria don't frankly know what to do. But on the other hand, the backbone, or one of the major supporters for the AKP, is the Musiad, the middle-tiered industries. And these industries are the ones who have benefited the most from the zero problems with neighbors policy. Okay? And in that they export, the major Tusiad industries, I spent a lot of time in Turkey as well, export primarily to Europe and the European Customs Union and benefit from that, Turkey's arrangement with Europe. These middle industries export to the GCC.